Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Byte-Sized HR powered by 𝗪𝗂𝗧. I'm your host 𝗪𝗂𝗍, and today we have a very special episode. Joining me is Joy Chen, CEO of the Multicultural Leadership Institute, a former deputy mayor of Los Angeles and executive recruiter for Fortune 500 CEOs and board member. Her leadership has spanned 3 industries across 3 continents. We'll delve into the insight from Joy's new Harvard Business Review article and her recent follow-up events at the Asia Society titled "Where Are the Asian CEOs?", focusing on practical steps for fostering inclusive leadership. Joy, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for being here.
Great. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. Well, if we kind of start off, as we've already mentioned in the introduction in regards to the Harvard Business Review article, let's jump into it straight away with this first question being, your HBR article and recent Asia Society event highlight a significant issue, which I even found myself to be quite, I was quite shocked to hear that. Is the least I can say, that it was such a case, and after discussing with you, discovering it more. But for our audience, the underrepresentation of Asian employees in leadership roles, despite their qualification. Can you share why this topic is important for companies today?
Yeah, well, in fact, Asians represent half of the workforce in high-tech companies, at least in Silicon Valley, but most of these employees are unable to contribute fully to corporate results. So this is an urgent issue, actually, for all knowledge economy companies. If you think about it, imagine half the people on your payroll aren't fully contributing, and there are systemic barriers to their fully contributing to their work and to the aspirations of the company. So that's one thing. That's where the baseline is right now. Also, it's because society is really rapidly shifting. Asians also are the fastest growing workforce in America. They represent 60% of the world's population. So this is an issue for any company that is interested in increasing productivity and in growing.
Beautiful, and I can only agree in regards to that. And as mentioned as well in the introduction, there was also the Asia Society panel that you had the chance of holding and organizing, which again, kudos to you, an amazing presentation, which we'll definitely be bringing again into the links in the sources of this podcast. But you mentioned something in the Asia Society panel, and that was that most educated and most likely to be hired, but least likely to be promoted when speaking of the Asian employees. Can you elaborate on this paradox, quite frankly, and why many companies systematically underutilize the Asian employees?
Yeah. Yeah, it is a paradox, and it is surprising, isn't it? Because most people assume that Asians are hyper successful. So I find it helpful to explain that, in fact, Asians suffer from an age 30 problem. We're the most successful group at gaining an education and gaining entry-level jobs. But then at just the age when we should start to leverage all that hard work and education to soar, we plummet. So we're the least promoted group in corporate America. We're about 13% of the US professional workforce, but only 1.5% of Fortune 500 corporate officers.
Which is ridiculous, quite
The
frankly.
situation is even worse for Asian women, who are only about 7% of Asians in the C-suite. And Asians are over half of all Fortune 1000 company boards have no Asian directors. Yeah, so it is very systemic after age 30, the least successful group after age 30.
I'm quite speechless, actually, on when looking at those numbers. It's just absolutely ridiculous, is the least I can say in regards to that. But thank you very much for your answer. Is there anything else you wanted to add on that point?
Yeah, well, I think most company leaders, when I share about these issues, express the same reaction that you do: surprise, shock. I mean, because most company leaders, like you, are committed to inclusion. But oftentimes they're unaware of how their own leadership and communication styles are culturally rooted. And so they think what a leader looks like, or they just focus their attention on the people who perhaps may be louder or communicate in more direct ways. And so they inadvertently marginalize people from other cultural backgrounds. So I'll just give you an example. Like, I often hear leaders say things like, "Oh yeah, our Asian employees, they're so smart and they work so hard. They just lack communication skills." Well, Asians are very diverse. But the one thing that they have in common is they comprise 60% of the world's population. So when you disparage the communication skills or the leadership skills of 60% of the world's population, that really reveals an opportunity for the speaker, to grow in our understanding of cultural differences, right? We cannot just objectively say, over half, 2/3 of the world's population don't know how to communicate. Maybe we don't really know how to effectively manage or communicate with them.
There's going to be a change on the mindset. Yeah, 60% is is not a small number that we can just ignore. Completely agree in regards to that. And so if we can dig a bit further into those cultural biases and also the stereotypes as barriers for the Asian employees, can you elaborate on specific biases that you've identified in corporate settings and how they manifest in everyday workday interaction and in decision-making processes?
Yeah. And so, just taking a step back, I think
Yes.
that most leaders, as I said, they really aim to create inclusion. They genuinely respect all the people on their teams. But maybe their cultural toolkits are not yet broad enough. They don't yet have the knowledge and the tools to really create inclusion for those whose styles differ from them. So, for example, when it comes to stereotypes of leadership, Asians face a double whammy, right? So Westerners tend to consider a leader as someone who is assertive and charismatic and dominant, right? So these are our conceptions in the West of a leader. And our conceptions of an ideal follower is highly competent, passive, docile, hardworking. And in that sense, Asians face a double whammy because the traits that Asians and the stereotypes of Asians and the traits that we're raised in are 100% the opposite of the traits of the quote ideal leader, right? We're raised to be very self-effacing. We're raised to be very focused on we instead of me. So we're raised to not self-promote. We're raised to be humble and to prioritize the needs of our team. And that runs directly counter to these stereotypes, the traits of an ideal leader. And the traits that Asians have been raised in run 100% aligned to the traits that we consider an ideal follower to be: highly competent, quote, passive. The way that people perceive Asians to be is that people perceive Asians to be not leaders and ideal followers, when actually these are just a matter of cultural styles. So all this creates what organizational psychologists call role incongruence. Because Asians are perceived as not leaders and perfect followers, organizations are less likely to promote or even to invest in Asians as leaders. But fortunately, the research here also points to a solution, because it turns out that when Asians are promoted to leadership roles, Asians are perceived as equally effective as white leaders. So the solution here is clear, that we should promote qualified Asians to management and board roles. And when we put them into those roles, then we actually do two things. Number one, we debunk these harmful stereotypes. And two, we benefit from the diverse leadership styles and perspectives that, diverse people bring.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you for elaborating that a bit more in details in regards to that. And in a way, I feel that there needs to be, I kind of already mentioned it, the mind change, but agreed, it is a cultural aspect. It's also the way we were educated, the way we grew, which of course has an influence as well as how you define a leader. But both sides bring a lot to the table, and that needs to be considered. So I could only agree with you on that one, and really appreciate also bringing in the psychological term and the research behind it that provides proof to this strong points that you're mentioning here. Definitely. And if moving forward, so we've looked into the aspect of the stereotypes and the biases and debunking it, I think is the best way of putting it that way. But could you also tell me a bit more in regards to the tie between diversity and corporate performance? By that, I mean that cultural differences can power innovation or lead to greater marginalization, depending on how leaders leverage these differences. Therefore, could you elaborate or tell us a bit more on what you've seen regarding this dynamic?
Yeah, I think that is such an important question, Lo, because we often, I think, assume when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we assume that diversity will lead to innovation. And I think in the last few years, there's been a huge focus on creating greater diversity, which is very, very important in our companies. But the fact is, the research shows diversity does not always lead to inclusion. In fact, diversity most often leads into three buckets of performance. One is it leads to polarization on the teams. Second, it leads to this question of underperformance, where the people who are different culturally get left out somehow. And only a few companies actually, in only a few companies does diversity actually lead to innovation. So what's the secret? What divides the companies where diversity is leading to marginalization in many cases, like we see with Asians, and where diversity is powering innovation? It comes down to the leaders. It comes down to whether leaders can effectively recognize and leverage cultural differences as an asset to performance. So when leaders don't effectively leverage cultural differences, then the default is that diversity leads to marginalization and to underperformance. So this question of inclusion is incredibly important. And I think that in the United States, at least, there's been a huge focus on race and gender. And both of those are very, very important. But race and gender are both culturated terms, right? They both underlying have to do with culture. And when it comes to Asians, it's not just stereotype bias, right? It's not just looking at your skin color and making all these assumptions. That's very important. But when it comes to Asians, also, it goes even further than that, because as you look at their behaviors, you may say, that behavior does not look like a leader. That behavior looks very passive. That behavior looks like a follower, right? And so it's going beyond the surface stereotypes and understanding that different people have different cultural styles, and making a commitment to and understanding how to shift from enforcing culture fit to Western styles to embracing culture add. That is the only way that we will really be able to leverage all the benefits that we're hoping for when we create diverse teams. Embracing culture add.
I think we just found the quote of the day. Very
Hey.
well said. I hope our audience right now is taking notes as well in regards to what you just mentioned. And considering what you just stated, if we take a step back and look at it from a global nature, and specifically with today's workforce, what are some best practices? So let's get more into the practical aspect, into which you've already provided some, but other concrete aspect that we can take down. But what are some best practices for multinational companies to ensure they are inclusive and supportive of Asian employees across different regions?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is for leaders to better understand culture and cultural differences. Because when the focus is just on diversity, what ends up happening is that a team can become demographically diverse, but remain culturally homogenous, right? And in that case, like, we're only going to select people based on these very Western leadership characteristics like charisma and displays of confidence. Because what happens then when a team remains culturally homogenous is that the people who are native to the leader's culture will naturally become more and more powerful and more confident, right? Because people are really questioning their right to be in the room. And then cultural outgroup members, like most Asians, then they face a dilemma. Asians, introverts, women, not just Asians, right? People who are cultural outgroup members face a dilemma. They either have to assimilate or they'll be marginalized. So how did I become deputy mayor at age 31? People ask me a lot. I became the whitest Chinese person you ever met, right? Because I always grew up in these environments that are very culturally homogenous. So I think that our goal, if we really want to create inclusion, we need to really understand cultural differences at a very deep level, not just, having a festival, having a dragon boat race or celebrating Lunar New Year, but these cultural differences beneath the surface, the differences that make a difference to team performance. And what happens is when leaders don't understand these differences, Asians especially tend to get marginalized because on many teams, Asians are the most visibly culturally different from the norm. Okay, like for example, just in the United States, 71% of Asian American adults are immigrants, while only 17% of all American adults are immigrants. And even the Asians who are born here, like me, tend to be the children of those immigrants. So we're raised in Asian ways, even if we speak perfect English, right? So companies tend to be run by Western ways that most Americans were raised in, but which are very different from the ways that most Asians were raised in. And I think we often see this in global companies too. As an executive search consultant, I worked across Europe, Asia, as well as North America. And across Western companies, we still see these cultural dynamics where you may have diverse teams, but especially at the top, it remains culturally homogenous. And so inadvertently, leaders are forcing culture fit and selecting for culture fit to Western norms. And we're not saying that Western bad, Asian good at all. We're saying these will remain Western companies. And that's a great thing. And that drives innovation, entrepreneurialism, all the confidence and all the optimism that Western and American companies are admired for. But at the same time, we also want to be able to make room. If we're going to have diverse cultural outgroup members in our company, we need to enable them to contribute fully and to be able to thrive and have successful careers.
Definitely. Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, so you grabbed my attention as well with the dragon, but I was like, oh, I do miss those.
Yeah, I think
And the
those are
Lunar New
great.
Year's as well. They were
It's
fantastic
great
events.
to celebrate those things. It's great to celebrate those things, but that cannot be the beginning and end of our understanding of culture. And, oftentimes we'll have a big Lunar New Year celebration, and that may lull leaders into feeling like, okay, I've done my part. I've included Asians. I had my Lunar New Year. Now I'm going to get back to work. When these kinds of cultural differences that make a difference are not really being addressed.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel in a way it's nice that you actually broke down that example that I was putting at you. Well said in that one. A question in regards to the the company who is also supporting us on this podcast of Byte-Sized HR, so from 𝗬𝗏. At 𝗬𝗏 specifically, we emphasize the importance of data-driven approaches to improving employee engagement. How can companies use data? Which, let's be honest, there's plenty of organizations today that utilize data. The question is how they use it is always the big question mark there. But regardless, use data to identify and address biases in the hiring and promotion practices, particularly for the Asian employees.
Yeah. Well, I would encourage companies to look closely at promotion data, since, as we had said earlier, Asians are the most hired but least promoted, but most educated, right?
Yeah.
So most hired and most educated, but least promoted. So I would encourage companies to see if that is happening at our company. And if so, at what points? Is it between L1 and L2, L3 and L4? We know that these kinds of even a 5%, shift in underrepresentation at each level can really add up, so that over time these effects compound, and you can end up with, with the kinds of disparities that we talked about earlier. So one thing I would look very closely at promotion data. Also, I would look at who's getting those stretch opportunities when we have these secret high potential employee lists. Who's getting on those? Are Asians represented on those, and other cultural outgroup members? Who's getting those committee plum stretch assignments? Who's getting mentored and sponsored? oftentimes when we're just relying on informal mentorship and sponsorship, of course, we all connect more closely with folks like us, leaders. There are very few Asian leaders up there. And as a result, many Asian employees just have little or no mentorship and sponsorship. So basically, not just the promotion data, that is absolutely key, but also who's getting all those important network resources that we all need to move up in Western companies. Also, the category Asians is a very diverse group. Again, as I said, coming from people representing 60% of the world's population. So you better want to understand the experiences. It would also be helpful to break out South Asians, like Indians and Pakistani, from East Asians, like Chinese, Korean, Japanese, from Southeast Asians, like Thai or Malaysian, because we find that there are real disparities, even within those big, broad numbers that we talked about. There are broad disparities within those three categories, and also men and women. For example, South Asian men tend to be promoted at a much higher rate than all those other groups.
Interesting. And in a way, yes, I completely agree. And I loved how you also kind of looked at it from inside the Asian society as well. So thank you for that. And there was one question that kind of looks at it from two different angles between China and the USA. Question actually that was written by my colleague Michaela, who wanted me to bring it up towards you directly. So I hope she will enjoy the answer. But Joy, your work has had a profound impact in China. There's no denying it. And for those watching on video, you can even see it in her background with the lovely books and so on. But how do the leadership challenges faced by Asian employees in the US compare to those in China? And what lessons can we learn from both contexts?
Yeah, well, I was really honored and privileged to work in China between 2011 and 2020 when the pandemic started. And during that time, I created global leadership training. I wrote a book for women. I was invited to write a book for women, and I wrote one called Do Not Marry Before Age 30, and that was a big hit in 2011. And I followed it up with a book called How to Get Lucky in Your Career. And all that launched me as a speaker and global leadership training. And I set up a firm that created courses and trainings that reach millions of professionals in China. And just like the work that I do now, that work was focused on helping professionals to thrive and succeed in working in global companies, and really to understand these cultural differences and how to master and leverage them to be more successful in their careers. So I help leaders in China do that, and I help professionals in China with training. For Chinese professionals, so what I was doing in China is really helping Chinese professionals and leaders who are engaging in global companies. So let's say they're working inside Western companies, or they were doing business with Western companies, to really understand these cultural differences and how do I be more successful. Not be marginalized by them, but to leverage those cultural differences and connect more deeply with colleagues and clients from all backgrounds. For Chinese professionals focused within domestic companies, I mean, there's huge swaths of the Chinese economy that everyone's Chinese, everyone that you work with is Chinese, 97% of China's population is ethnic Chinese like me. And so if you're working, let's say, for a government-owned enterprise, or you're working like in smaller companies, you may never have any contact with Western companies in your daily work. And so for them, we see very few of these issues because everyone was sort of raised the same way, and there's very little diversity on those teams. So I guess what I would say is the leadership challenges that Chinese employees faced in China in dealing with Western companies are quite similar to the leadership challenges that we're seeing now for Asian employees working in Western companies. And that's why we do a lot of training for Asian employees to learn how to be both effective and authentic working in Western companies. And then also working with leaders now. And so let's say I am a leader of a multinational team. How do I deeply engage and sell to my colleagues and clients, deeply engage and mobilize colleagues and clients from all different backgrounds? How do I very fluidly shift my perspectives and adapt my behaviors so that I can deeply connect with and mobilize people from different backgrounds? So it's really fun stuff, and it's really exciting. It helps us be more effective leaders and more effective humans, and helps our companies to more effectively leverage the diversity in our ranks and also achieve our ambitions for growth.
Definitely. And I feel in a way people will probably, when listening to the question, I don't think many people were expecting that the answer would be a two-way situation, in the sense that the problem isn't just one direction. They're probably facing the exact same problem the other way. So yes, definitely. Thank you very much in regards to the answer to that question, the details provided. Moving forwards, as we do have quite a few more questions that we need to debunk, but in your article, you discuss the importance of addressing unconscious biases. Can you share some methods or training programs, which is something you've already started highlighting, that have proven effective in reducing these biases, especially those discussed in your recent webinar?
Yeah, well, I think that the research, there's been a lot of training in the realm of unconscious bias training here, especially within the United States. And of course, we know on one hand, it's provoked a certain amount of political backlash in society. It's provoked a certain backlash within companies, especially when it's been mandatory. But when we actually look at the research around the efficacy of unconscious bias training when it's been delivered, we've often found that the results have been quite mixed, set even apart from the backlash, because a lot of this training is about like understanding what are the biases that could be infecting your daily decision making, and being careful to avoid those biases. And what researchers have found is that in our daily work, focusing on understanding biases and trying to not be biased in every second of the day takes a huge amount of mental resources, right? Because these are mental shortcuts that our brains often just immediately go to. That takes a huge amount of mental resources, and it's very difficult to focus on doing that and get done everything else that we need to get done in a day, right? And so, what that research has found, and pulling apart, basically the kind of work that we're doing now is we understand what those biases are, but really what we're working on doing now is affirmatively just expanding the cultural toolkits of leaders and saying, this is the way, helping leaders just to gain an understanding affirmatively of culture and culture differences, and helping them grow their own cultural self-awareness and understand that, okay, I have been raised in a way that we value direct communication, and we really cherish displays of confidence. When I was an executive search consultant, we explicitly looked for people who displayed confidence. But there are other ways of leading, and to see the cultural logic of other ways. Asians, for example, because there's this collectivist mentality, a real focus on team, contributing to the team, and be incredibly respectful of other people. And so going out of our way to be very nuanced and indirect in our communication, and that's out of respect. And so what we're doing now is to debunk unconscious biases, is not just by directly addressing the, avoiding bias mentality, but to say, let's expand, it's a little bit of cultural anthropology, which is always fascinating, right? Saying, where do cultures come from? How do we better understand how my own behaviors are culturally informed? Other people's behaviors are culturally informed. And how do I deeply, shift my perspectives and shift my behaviors so that I am creating an environment where everyone can be both effective and authentic, so that cultural outgroup members don't face this dilemma of be effective or be authentic, right? We want everyone to be effective and authentic in our companies, because that's how we can maximize our productivity, and that's how we can grow our companies, especially given the demographic shifts currently underway in America and in the world.
Definitely, while making also an environment for workers, for the workforce to be comfortable within. And don't get me wrong, it is definitely not limited to, as you clearly mentioned, but when it comes to continuous feedback, which I think is also as important in the specific categorization of environments and how one may feel. But for instance, at 𝗓𝗏1, we believe in continuous feedback and improvement. And therefore, the question being, how can an organization implement continuous learning and development programs to support the growth of Asian employees into leadership roles?
Sure, that's a great question. Because I think, on one hand, we need leaders to be able to understand how to better include. But at the end of the day, we do have Western companies. And so we also need to help our Asian employees who've been trained up, raised up in totally different unwritten rules of the game in their families, right? So for example, for me, like many Asians, I was raised to believe that success in society will come if I follow the rule of two things beginning with HAR, Harvard and hard work. I thought that if I could just do everything possible, to get into Harvard, get all the good test scores and straight A's and win math competitions and piano, and I could get myself into Harvard and I worked really hard, then I would get to the top in American society. And you and I know, Loic, that's not how it works,
No.
right? So help Asian employees understand and gain clarity on the unwritten rules of the game and get deeply rooted in themselves and understand also, when I was talking about we need to help leaders shift perspectives and shift their behaviors to be successful, we especially need to help Asians because they tend to be, serious outgroup members in our companies. And in fact, Asia Society research has found that professional development is something that Asians crave. Professional development is the #1 predictor of Asian employee satisfaction and belonging. And Asia Society found companies have consistently struggled to provide targeted professional development for Asians because most all our professional development assumes you're a Westerner. You already got all this, right? Because it's written, most professional development is created by Westerners and for our audience of Westerners. And so it's not been effective for Asians. And in fact, ineffective training, leadership training, often research shows does Asians more harm than good, because when that training fails, companies often assume that the trainee lacked leadership skills after all, so they get further marginalized, and then stereotypes of Asians as poor leaders get further reinforced. So we have to equip Asian Americans with professional development that meets their unique needs. And so how we do that at Multicultural Leadership Institute is to help Asian employees gain clarity and strength in their cultural roots while mastering and leveraging the unwritten rules of Western leadership cultures. And we equip them to fluidly shift their perspectives. Okay, I see things my way, but now I can see things from my leader's way, and so that they can be effective and authentic in every situation.
I'm still shocked by the fact that when you were mentioning that they crave it and they were actually #1, I was like, wow, who would have thought? But that's fantastic to hear that. Okay, good. Well, speaking of that, because luckily there are some Asian leaders who have managed to be an Asian leader. Thank you. What roles do Asian leaders themselves play in paving the way for the next generation of leaders within their community and beyond, as highlighted in your Asia Society event?
Yeah, well, I mean, fortunately, I'm one of many Asian leaders who, there are not very many of us. As I said, only 1.5% of Fortune 500 corporate officers are Asian. But for Asians who have achieved leadership roles, I think, there are many of us. And, I'm so lucky to be in a community of people like my co-author, Angela Tang-Simony, of the HBR article. She is a CHRO of Harvard Business Publishing, and others that you see around the Asia Society, around many other Asian professional organizations who are working to help open doors for our next generation and helping both Asian employees in their professional development, but also helping our organizations to better leverage Asian employees. As we said, Asian employees are by far half of the workforce in high-tech companies. This is a huge, so when that, half or even a third of your workforce is systemically unable to fully contribute to corporate results, profits, aspirations, that's a huge drag on corporate productivity that most companies are unaware of. So actually, in the HBR article, to help companies understand the scope of this issue, we actually quantify the drag on productivity and annual profits. Because, we often get people asking, saying, okay, let's say I want to invest in my Asian employees. How much should I invest? 50,000, 100,000, $1 million? And so, just like every other aspect of company operations, I have an MBA in finance from a million years ago, so dusted that off. And when we actually looked at, and I think it'll be great for HR leaders to do this kind of exercise more, not just to say, what is the cost? Right now, I'm investing $0. If I invest 100,000, that sounds like a lot of money. Where's that money going to come from? But in fact, turn that around and say, what is the cost of not acting? And what we showed is that, for example, for a 5,000 employee company in high tech, the annual drag on profits is $85 million. And if we impute that to maximizing to shareholder value, that translates on a 10x P ratio to $850 million haircut on enterprise value. For a 5,000 employee company, that is huge. That we're taking almost $1 billion off of shareholder value. Simply by having these barriers to Asian employee inputs, contributions. So if we look at the ROI of investing in Asians, that's a much better measure than saying, oh, what is the cost compared to $0,
Yeah, definitely.
So how much are we losing every single year now because our agents are unable to fully contribute?
The untapped potential behind it. Yeah. Definitely. I feel in a way like we had also a side note. I really want to say thank you to 𝗪𝗀𝗃 because it is also thanks to her indirectly that I got to know you, because if it wasn't for the podcast that we did with her, I wouldn't end up knowing about this article and reaching out to you. So big thank you to her indirectly as well.
Angela is the ultimate connector, and she's really just a model for, she's a role model to me and to so many for her commitment to the HR profession and to also making our world better.
And yeah, big thank you to her as well for the insight she gave us on the last podcast. So audience, please feel free to check it out. But we'll also link her profile on LinkedIn if you'd like to learn a bit more about her in the process and the impact that she's made. But on that note as well, when looking at the cost of inaction, I found it interesting because we had a podcast as well recently, of course, not necessarily in the Asian employee, but still number-wise on the return on investment of engagement. Because a lot of companies were kind of looking at, yeah, but you can't quantify that. Just buy more softwares or just put them more paperwork that will teach them learning and development. But the questions aren't being asked the right way. The approach is not being looked at the right way. And then you can actually, we figured it out with our podcast, which is someone in the finance industry in an American company, but you can actually quantify that approach. And it gives you a good insight into the cost of inaction, which, as you've mentioned here, is quite brutal and is quite important to consider and look at.
Yeah, and I think that's something that, we often, every company says our people are our most important asset, but it's hard for financial decision makers, right? Because if you're buying a building, I came from real estate finance, there is a price. And it's easy to, see what the price is because intersection of, supply and demand, right? Well, there's a price of the building and then you get a mortgage and everything is very clear. And you say, well, do I want to proceed with this deal or not? So it's easy to quantify the costs and ROI of tangible assets. But every company says our people are our most important assets. But it's often very hard for HR to get the attention of financial decision makers and say, but I want to invest in our most important assets. And so somehow that's why I think in this HBR article, we said, well, we maybe never have invested in our Asian employees in the past, or we've underinvested clearly. But here's the cost of the systemic underutilization of our Asian employees, that they're on our payroll, but they can't contribute. And here's the cost every year, year in and year out of that. What if we invest a little to take away those barriers? And so I think that making that direct connection for HR is something that can be very helpful. And I hope that, in this article, we've actually put in all of our cost assumptions and the return of investment assumptions, so that any company can say, okay, I'm going to change this assumption here. And you can basically do your own calculation based on what we have provided in the article. And, maybe that's something that over time, can be helpful. I would hope that it might be helpful for HR leaders, maybe who don't have a finance background, to say, okay, this is how I could approach making that financial case for investing in our people, for Asians, but then also for all the other investments that I'm looking to make.
Definitely. Thank you very much on that one. And definitely, I mean, if we re-emphasize this to our audience, feel free, well, actually, I would love to say, please go check it out, the articles that we will have in the sources, where you're going to get more in depth, more details. And also in what Joy is stating, I've seen it for myself in the recent event that she organized. There's definitely a reaction happening. So it's step by step, but there is a change in mentality in that one. It can be seen by the engagement, it can be seen by the interaction you're getting, Joy, from all the work you've done surrounding it. So truly a pleasure to have you, quite humble as well to be able to have this discussion with you. And of course, a big thank you to our partner 𝗪𝗏 and to our audience. Thank you very much, Joy, and to the rest of our audience. Have a great day ahead. Cheers.
Well, Loic, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to every member of our audience for your interest in this topic. Loic, you've been absolutely delightful to be with today, and I hope we continue this conversation.
Definitely. I'm sure there's much more. Well, there's a lot more to be discussed. And I'm sure I would love to even hear in 1-2 years, see how things have evolved, simply as that, see if the numbers are still the same, or if we finally start seeing a difference, a shift within the numbers. All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Joy. Take care.
Bye.